Say what again, Fred?
No, you know what you just said. Say it again.
Oh, that I disagree with Wally's opinion. Lorraine Williams invented Dungeons and Dragons. Yeah, I do still disagree with that.
Hi, welcome to How to D&D. My name is Fred Wheeler, and today I want to talk about Dungeons and Dragons. Not particularly any specific version of Dungeons and Dragons, but I'm not going to do that alone because I'm going to use a Dungeon Master Roundtable, and we're going to talk about who created Dungeons and Dragons and how it was created. It's actually quite a complicated topic. I have a lot of people here. We're going to put you through the roller, basically, of giving a lot of opinion and a lot of facts, and then whatever you do with it is up to you. Okay, but before we do that, I'd like to get everybody to introduce themselves. So, Jordan.
Yeah, so I'm Jordan, aka Flutes Loot. My wife and I have a YouTube channel and a website pretty much devoted to TTRPG talk, primarily D&D 5e, and I've got a background in improvisation that I put into D&D as well.
Cool, thank you. Wally.
Hi folks, Wally DM here, and I have a YouTube channel focused on puzzles and traps and not very much history.
What about you, Josiah?
Yeah, my name is Josiah, but I am known on the internet as Dungeon Dad. I have a YouTube channel called Dungeon Dad. It's about Dungeons and Dragons. You can find it on YouTube on the internet.
AJ, what about you?
My name's AJ Pickett, also known as the Mighty Glue Stick, and I do stuff on Dungeons and Dragons lore, so this is right up my alley.
Okay, so there's a lot of lore. This was actually spawned, this particular concept or video is going to be quite long, and I'm going to say right now that it was spawned by a poll I put up on my YouTube channel, and I asked this question, and a lot of people gave various answers, and I thought, well, actually, let's pull it apart because some of the conversations were quite aggressive and some of them were fine. And so we're going to go through and I'm going to ask some questions and everybody's going to respond. And then we're just going to keep doing that until we get to the end here. And then hopefully you're still around and you've formed your own opinion at the end. So the first question is really, really simple, and you can make it as simple as you like and use whatever you like with that. And that is, who do you think created Dungeons and Dragons? Like, who created it? What about you, Jordan?
So when I look into this, I see that it is a complicated question, but I want to try to break it down. So D&D, Dungeons and Dragons, is essentially a game or even a almost like a brand in and of itself. So if we're just saying who created D&D, I feel like I have to say TSR, the company, and not like a person. But I think as we get into some more of these questions, we will learn some of the nuances of my answer there.
Okay, thank you. What about you, Wally? Who created Dungeons and Dragons?
I would like to preface my answer by saying that I did a lot of cramming for this test today. I watched a lot of videos. I read a lot of things over the past, today and yesterday. And I'm going to answer this with, I'm not giving facts for my answers today. Let's start with that. So with that in mind, I'm not giving facts. I'm just giving what I think. And I think that who created D&D is just an evolution of things. I really don't think that there's one particular person. Sure, if I were to say that, I would say Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, and I would be done. But after watching all of these documentaries and things like that, I'm seeing just how little pieces of certain old war games. I mean, games going all the way back to the 1800s get piece by piece by piece, and it's just like all of these people have their own little pieces of D&D. And then it was just brought to the forefront by Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax, who put it all together.
Thank you, Wally. What about you, Josiah? What do you think? Because I know everybody's done quite a lot of SWAT.
Yeah, Wally basically just ripped off my real answer, which is he ripped it off before I even got a chance to say it. So I guess that's not really ripping it off. But I think the real answer is that it definitely was just this kind of collaborative thing that over many years a lot of people have contributed to, and it basically just turned into a giant garbage pile, and then some of that garbage was pulled away and we got a game, sort of, is what the real answer to that is. I mean, if we're talking like legally, I mean, that's just a matter of public record, right? But I do think that I don't know, that's between Gary Gygax, Dave Arneson, and God, who created it or who had like the original idea. I don't know, but I think the game as it ended up anyways, by the time it got really popular, was very much a team effort.
AJ, what about you?
So we're talking Dungeons and Dragons, not role playing in general. So because that's where you go back into the 1800s and stuff, and start talking about Strategios, the American Civil War game. Well, not Civil War game, American War game. So Dungeons and Dragons was created by Gary Gygax out of the fantasy rule set that was created by Dave Arneson, and it was typed up with notes from Gary and Dave when they were collaborating and best friends together, by Gail Gaylord, and so that was who created it. Those three individuals, basically. It was because the reason why Dave Arneson didn't type it up because he was a terrible typist, essentially. But Gary was known for always hearing an idea from this new school of players and going, "Oh, we should make a rule set of that. We should make a rule set of that." He was a publisher from the Geneva branch of role players, whereas Arneson and his group of friends were from the Twin Cities. So they're basically in the Twin Cities, but they were sort of separated by social distance, not physical distance. Some of them even lived close by each other, but just didn't know they were also role playing gamers. And that was the largest and biggest concentration of war gamers in the world at the time. So it was the idea of a fantasy medieval war game grew out of the sort of the old school war gamers not being happy with things deviating from historical fact. And Dave Arneson was a younger player who had another group of younger players that he was collaborating with, and that was what the fantasy game grew out of. You even see it in today's modern Dungeons and Dragons that people will always argue historical medieval fact whenever they're bitching and moaning about something not being okay in the game. That's against the very spirit of Dungeons and Dragons. Like they made it a fantasy game to allow them creativity to play whatever they wanted, and to introduce the idea of more role play into the game.
Yeah. Okay, so when I looked at this, it is so complicated. I mean, on paper, it's Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, but then you've also got Jeff Perren, I believe, who certainly had a part to play in the whole thing. Dave Wesely definitely had a big part to play. David megarry, who also he was part of Dave Arneson's sort of Blackmoor game, and so the ideas that he developed were integrated into Dungeons and Dragons. And then there was a lot of play testers. I think people forget just how many people were play testing this game for Dave Arneson and for Gary to actually get to a point where it was something that they wanted to play and wanted other people to play. So it is very complicated.
Yeah, the idea of playtesting is kind of like the modern term we have for playtesting is it's something that you write a rule set up and then you get people to play it. This is the opposite, where people were playing the game and the rule set developed out of it. So Blackmoor was organically derived from people just developing more nuanced and role-playing ideas for war games. Dungeons and Dragons was created out of that rule set that was developed for it. So the very first instance of role playing was from Dave Wesley's Brownstein game, and that was a war game that had role playing elements. And then Blackmoor was developed beside that, and at the same time by Dave Arneson role playing with his group of new school players who were like high school people and stuff, whereas the war gamers and stuff were going off to like military colleges and stuff. So Dave Wesley's Brownstein game got taken over by Dave Arneson because Wesley went off to military service, and was that kickback from the original wargamers that caused Dave to develop this sort of thing off to the side almost in secret. But that Blackmoor game has been going every year since then, so it's one of the longest running campaigns almost. But they didn't originally play it as campaigns. That was another guy who developed the idea of campaigns, and like character attributes didn't pop up until May 22nd, 1971. But the actual first Blackmoor style game was April 17th, 1970. So it was 1970, 1971, 1972 where fantasy role-playing really began. And then Dungeons and Dragons, of course, was published by Gygax and Arneson after they met each other and developed that friendship. But unfortunately, that friendship just didn't broke down.
There's a long history of people fucking over other people. Business.
Yeah, it's got a long history of Gary Gygax running
there.
Yeah.
We'll get there. We'll get there. I mean, all of us probably got a fair idea if we've done about our research what it was like. So I guess one of the things that a lot of people don't realise is like the referee was referred to as the person who ran the game, and even in Dungeons and Dragons it was originally the referee. It wasn't the dungeon master. The concept of the dungeon master, my understanding was coined by Dave Arneson later on, once the rule set had already been published, and referred to the referee. So with the use of the concept of a referee in a Dungeons and Dragons game, and where did it get its origin from? So, like, who conceived of the referee in a role-play game that then got fed into Dungeons and Dragons? Does anybody sort of have any ideas around that? Because it's quite complicated. What about you, Jordan?
I read it, but I don't remember exactly who it was, so I'll defer to someone who remembers.
Wally?
I'm next in line, I guess. So, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, because I probably will be on a lot of these, but I believe it was David Wesely reviving it from, I believe the Stratego game was like created in the 1800s. It was a miniature war game, and then in the 1960s, David Wesely started bringing some of that game back. A lot of them were playing it, and the idea of the referee was brought back because they needed somebody to be able to make judgments over incidents that weren't covered in the rules. So if they didn't have a rule for it, they would be the final say. What I thought was really interesting, and I can't cite any sources because I don't remember, but was the fact that I think it was this one in particular, David Wesely, when he was running, it was it Brownstein game, that the referee would actually send all the players in a different room. While he was doing stuff like one-on-one with maybe one of the other players, and it was neat that while all the players were in the other room, they started conspiring against the referee. And when they came back, they just made a totally. It's probably the first derailment of in the history of Dungeons and Dragons. All the players came back from being in timeout, and they came back over here and just messed his world up. So,
what about you, Josiah? Thank you for that, Wally. That was great.
Yeah, no, I mean, Wally, I think covered the question specifically pretty well there and concisely. The only thing I would add is that I guess you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the whole concept of D&D, because originally it was just like a war game with fantasy elements, was it not? Before the idea of the referee was involved, because you had the whole chainmail situation going on where Gary Gygax had developed this other war game, and then in the back end there was this little section where he was like, also you can add dragons if you want to, and obviously as we discussed, war gamers were like, dragons, that's not historically accurate, but sure, whatever. And then the nerds who were like, that sounds cool, started kind of doing their own thing with the fantasy rule set, and I feel like that had a pretty significant influence on this idea that we need to, if we want to run adventures with smaller groups, we need someone who's in charge of dealing with the dragon half of Dungeons and Dragons, right?
What about you, AJ?
Well, so if you go back to the 1880s Strategos game, that was written by for the military, because they hadn't had any wars for some time. So they were a bit worried that the generals and stuff were going to fall out of practice at active warfare. So it was this very, very complicated, written in the 1880s, difficult historic text to read. And the reason why these wargamers originally got to meet each other is because, Arneson, for instance, went to the library, checked out the book, looked at who had checked out the book before, and went, they're probably into the same sort of thing I am, and contacted them, and that was how they all sort of met each other, which is astounding.
That's wild.
That is wild, isn't it? You just wouldn't do that these days. Look up somebody from a library checkout record, that'd be like, you stalking me, man? Anyway, so what Wesely had seized on with the referee, because they came up with different iterations of war games, and this is Napoleonic. Wargaming was very popular at the time. They didn't bother about modern war games and stuff. It was all Napoleonic stuff, because it was like ships of the line and things like that. In fact, the first collaboration between Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson in rule writing was this game called Don't Give Up the Ship in 1972, which they combined with the Braunstein Napoleonic game whenever it went to sea. And Dave Arneson did an enormous amount of research for that. When he took over from Wesely to run a Braunstein campaign, the amount of research he did was incredible. He looked up every single ship for every military and stuff that was around at that time. Think about how difficult that would be in 1970, right? No internet. Anyway,
no Wikipedia.
So yeah. Anyway, so the idea of the referee was to introduce the element of the fog of war, because in a tabletop war game, you can see everything that's going on unless you cover it up with bits of cloth and things like that. So Dave Wesley's idea of talking to the players individually in a separate room was to introduce the idea of intrigue, because he loved these games called Diplomacy and various other ones at the time, and he wanted to introduce the idea that warfare involves a lot of intrigue. Dave Arneson seized on this as, not only that, but like in the American Civil War, for instance, there was two generals who were on opposite sides of the war, but they both had financial interests in a railroad that was going through the area. So in the Civil War, nobody touched the railroad. When the Civil War was over, they went back into business and ran the railroad together. So there was the subtext of what was going on under the surface of these great war actions and battles and things. And Dave and both the Daves wanted to bring that to the fore. Historical Napoleonic wargamers weren't interested in that sort of thing. That's why Dave Arneson was running this sort of side game with the new school players, and this sort of what we would these days call an incubator, where these ideas were developed to enhance their games that they were playing with each other all the time. We do it in our games too. We call it homebrewing, right? So they were homebrewing war games to give them more and more fog of war elements and things like that, to get more nuance out of that 1880s treatise on warfare. So yeah, that was what fantasy wargaming really stemmed from. And then fantasy wargaming turned into role-playing because of that derailment of the people who were waiting to get instructions in the other room, role-playing amongst themselves without the referee's knowledge. So that was, he thought it was a disaster. They thought it was a great fun experience. And so they asked him to do it again and again and again, and that's where the Braunstein game developed into this almost cult-like following. That was what they wanted to play.
So, I was looking at this, and the concept of a referee actually comes from sports, and the military just adopted the concept of a referee as basically a judge who's supposed to be objective in terms of each side working against each other and determining what's going on, and it sounds like a bad thing when you think in terms of Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, because originally they played it like they were heads of state and they were sending letters and stuff to each other. So they weren't talking in character, but they were the character of the leader of that particular faction of army or nation or whatever. So a lot of their correspondence at the table were in the form of these diplomatic letters and attaches and things like that, which is really cool and stuff that we still use in our modern games.
Yeah, very much the player handout. So one of the things that Dave Arneson has said on numerous occasions is that the concept of the referee and then the development of the dungeon master for Dungeons and Dragons was very much Dave Wesely and and reading that Strategos and then the development of Strategos N, which I think Dave Wesely was responsible for. So, yeah, it's actually interesting that it actually came from somebody that Dave Arneson knew and that they got it from somewhere else. So it's not like it sort of, oh, somebody just popped up with this idea, let's use a dungeon master. It didn't quite work that way. All right, so I guess one of the other things that that is very key to Dungeons and Dragons that a lot of people kind of get a little bit confused around, and that is like who created the concept of the individual persona in a war game that then transitioned into having an individual persona in Dungeons and Dragons and various other role-play games. And like the person and the people involved in that and where it and how it came about is actually really, really interesting. What we're talking about is instead of playing one side of a force or faction or an army, you're playing a individual, like you are playing a character. You are the character. And this actually came out quite a lot well before Dungeons and Dragons was actually released. So, Jordan, what did you have in terms of like who came up with the sort of the concepts of the individual character?
As far as I can tell, it was Dave Wesely, playing with Dave Arneson. He floated the idea where they're looking at these armies, and he said, what if we just hyper-focused on one of them and just really went hard on that? It kind of reminds me of when I'd play Warcraft 3 or StarCraft back in my younger days, when you're doing macro war movements, but then people will mod the game and do something like Dota, Defense of the Ancients, League of Legends, where you just hyper-focus on one hero. You don't have to micro like a whole army and an economy so much. It's the same kind of thing. Dave Wesely took Warcraft and said, what if we made Dota? What if we took StarCraft and made League of Legends? He was doing wargaming, and he said, what if we made what essentially was fantasy role-playing?
Yeah. Wally, what did you get from all of this in terms of that question?
My answer was also David Wesely, and that was originating from the Brownstein game, where they were doing multiplayer, multi-objective type games, and instead of taking all these armies that you're commanding, you're actually taking the role of someone in that army. Or it could even be taking the role of an NPC. Maybe you're not even involved military-wise. You're involved as like a banker or something along those lines. And I know AJ will be able to finish that off, and Josiah and everybody. So I wanted to include one other thing that I thought was really cool. Actually, two. I remember hearing that the first role play was almost by accident. I could be wrong on that, where they were playing the game, and then all of a sudden they started talking into character. And Dave Wesely, like, what do I do with this? Why are you guys talking back and forth? So they actually started, players started communicating with each other by accident. And the second thing, on a personal note, so I used to play a lot of basic Dungeons and Dragons. It's the Beck-Me series, where you've got 5 different box sets: red, blue, green, black, and the Immortal set, the gold set. In the green set, they have, oh man, I'm going to forget the name of this, but they actually have a war machine in there. So my brother and I, when I first got the companion set, and it's for, I think, levels 15 to 25 in basic, and we would have, it's based on the feudal system. And my brother played a character. He was a fighter and became a landowner and started doing castles. Built a castle. He was given a barony, and then he started going out and conquering lands, and then it became a county and stuff like that. But they actually had all the statistics in there that you could grow your army, you could grow your nation, and things like that. And we would actually have these simulated battles, and his character would be one of those. As this battle is going on, his character is either commanding troops or a little side mission or something like that. So after I watched all this and did this research for this video, I just thought it was fascinating that at that point I kind of came full circle. We went from these war games, and then we went to individual characters, and then I went right back to individual characters to war games through the companion set of the Beck-Me series.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Josiah, what did you have in terms of this?
David Wesely was also the information that I was able to find when doing a little research for this. I do think that it is also important to mention that this was kind of a sentiment that was developing, I think, at a lot of different tables, all kind of around the same time, where people are getting this idea, what if we were doing more character-driven stuff? So I think that was probably a contributing factor. Also, I guess just to contribute something to this part of the conversation, I think it's really interesting what Wally was just talking about, how we, or you specifically in that instance, Wally, went from wargaming to role-playing individual characters back to the other end. And I think that that's a trend that we've seen like pretty much all throughout D&D's history. Like right now, more people are playing 5th edition than ever. That's a statistic that comes up all the time when we're talking about this kind of stuff. It's like 80% of people who play D&D, 5th edition was the first edition they ever played. I think it says a lot when you have Kickstarters like this Matthew Colville Kickstarter, the first one that he did like 3 or 4 years back for Kingdoms and Warfare, which was specifically rules for how to take your D&D characters and give them castles and wizard towers and lands and baronies and like populaces that they're responsible for, and like rules for building armies and like making them fight other armies and stuff like that, which is really funny to me because as that was happening, it was like, wow, yeah, like there's two communities, the wargaming community and the role-playing community are so intertwined. And I think it says a lot too when you look at that Kickstarter. It's the most successful Kickstarter I think like ever. Not even just role-playing games. I think it's raised more money than any Kickstarter ever. I don't know if that's still true, but at the time I know it was pretty close. So yeah, I don't know. I think that that's very interesting. I think that it's like a natural progression to go from one to the other, or if you start with role-playing to go from that to wargaming, because it's just like a different breed of the same kind of thing. So when you look at all the wargaming stuff, it makes sense that that's what people would start with, but it's like a perfectly natural through line leading into something like D&D, I think.
AJ, what about you in terms of the individual persona? Is there something you'd like to add in terms of what you think and so forth with regard to that?
Lots of interesting things brought up there. So yeah, Wesely had the individuals who were in that diplomatic function, and then Arneson, when he took over the game, came up with individual character traits. So the idea of a character sheet with individual traits for charm and personality and influence and wealth and things like that was Arneson's contribution to Braunstein. But at the same time that he was also running Blackmoor, and he was also running another game which was based on Banana Republic. So there was this land called Bananaramia or something like that, and Arneson was playing a character Poncho Villa, and so they were definitely personalities, and role playing really developed in that sort of game. But the Blackmoor game was responsible for so many firsts. So you had your first wizard in a game, you had a first paladin in a game, you had your first halfling monk in a game, you had your first half-elf, you had the first individual who played a dwarf. Dwarf didn't even have a name. It developed out of a character getting sidelined, and that player took over the role of one of the dwarf's NPCs in a party, and so he was just the dwarf. And he carried on playing that character as the dwarf without a name for something like 30 years. You know, so all of the firsts of role-playing came from Blackmoor, not from Dungeons and Dragons. A lot of the characters that we are now familiar with, Mordenkainen and Bigby and Fizzband and all these other guys, developed out of the first players in Gary Gygax's game, Dungeons and Dragons, and that was the play testing and stuff, but that was like his kids and things like that, and friends who were playing Dungeons and Dragons for the first time. But all of the firsts of fantasy role-playing came from Blackmoor. Yeah, and it's kind of interesting in that we think of Blackmoor Castle as just like Castle Greyhawk and Castle Blackmoor are kind of the same thing. They're this location, and then the world is built around it. This castle complex, and all of the idea of role playing was that there was some trouble at the castle. The local lord wanted you to go and tame this area, and then your adventurers would go in and kick the shit out of everything, get killed, get loot, and eventually become lords and ladies of their own, and get granted lands and title and things like that. So yeah, in many ways, with building on what Wally and Josiah said, we have been bottlenecked in 5th edition into a purely role-playing thing without those elements of building the world and your character being a part of that world, being an influencer and a builder of that world and that civilization. So that was why I think Matt Colville's iteration of like castles and things was such a success because it was bringing back a lot of the elements that we felt have been snipped out of Dungeons and Dragons because they were too complicated and too much like role playing, like war games. But look at the success of skirmish games like Frostmourne and things like that. It's very easy to transition between the two smoothly. It's almost like zooming in on a character in a computer game. You zoom in on that character and then you're in that first person perspective of that character. But we don't have any electronic games that can smoothly transition between a war game, zooming out, and being strategic and turn-based, and zooming in and being real-time in that character's point of view and doing things and just narrowed down to that character's viewpoint and that having an impact on the game. It's too complex for an electronic game to handle something like that. They've tried it, they've failed. But role-playing games can handle it with ease.
Also, just a quick addendum to what I said. I looked it up because I was curious. That Matt Colville Kickstarter ended up at over $2 million. It was the most successful RPG Kickstarter of all time, is what it was, and the most successful Kickstarter for a book of all time.
Yeah.
It was an RPG book, and people said, "Here's $2 million," and he said, "Okay, I guess I'm a millionaire now. I quit my job and I'm making this book forever."
That really made the entire publishing industry go, "What?
Excuse me? Yeah.
How? Where?"
I mean, that was Strongholds and Followers. Was that one? His second Kickstarter, which was 2 years later, didn't do quite as well. It only did $1.5 million. So I mean, there's clearly a need and want for that kind of stuff, right?
And now we've got MCDM Studios and the Arcadia magazine, which is absolutely fantastic. It's like Dragon Magazine and Dungeon Magazine Type 2, Part 2.
So one of the things I thought was really interesting when looking at the individual persona that sort of was created in wargaming and then developed into role-play games and D&D was that Dave Wesley's Braunstein game, when he describes what he's doing, is he explained that if you talk as a referee in a game like this with individual personas and you use a lot of rules language, it's just appalling and horrible to deal with at the table. And so it all became very narrative. He said the referee was dealing with these individual personas, and what they were doing was breaking everything down very quickly in their head, what they thought would take place given whatever the person was trying to do. But one of the other aspects to it, which Dave Arneson latched onto very strongly, was Dave Wesley's use of diplomacy. Because what he did is he did a lot of research into resolving conflict peacefully, of all things. So the game of Dungeons and Dragons and role-play games and this Braunstein game was very much about communication between different parties, different individuals, and coming to a peaceful resolution of all, would you believe it? A peaceful resolution. So for those of you out there who get a hard time from anybody when you're playing your Dungeons and Dragons games or your roleplay games, and you managed to get through it and you didn't slay anybody or burn them down with magic, you're doing the right thing, because obviously they've been doing it for a long time. They understood the concept behind it. So there's some worth to it. So I thought that was quite interesting too.
Yeah.
I think part of that story, wasn't it that Dave Arneson and someone else didn't get along very well, and so he like put them at both at like separate ends of the world or whatever it was they were playing. Dave Wesley did, and then they went off and did their little private time or whatever. When they came back, they're like, "Oh yeah, by the way, we're doing a duel." Like, what? But I put you way over here. Yeah, we decided, and so I thought that's pretty cool.
Yeah, we're going to meet in No Man's Land, and we had a discussion. We didn't tell you about that. We've decided that we can't deal with this. We're just going to kill each other instead. Yeah.
Back when the players ran the game.
That's right. Back when
So make D&D great again.
Yeah. So one of the things that keeps coming up when you talk about Dungeons and Dragons, and I know there's a reason why there's so much confusion around it, but I'm not going to say anything about that. What I want to talk about is like who created Chainmail, the rule set, because a lot of people assume when we're talking about Chainmail, the rule set, we're talking about, well, that's Dungeons and Dragons, that's early Dungeons and Dragons, but it's kind of not really. So I thought what would be a good idea is to talk about Chainmail and who actually created it. And Jordan, what did you have for this question?
Yeah, famously, Ernest Gary Gygax was the one who penned it, I suppose, after he was struggling with publishing and he finally got a gig where he was able to get by and support a family and not just rely on being a cobbler in his basement with people's shoes. Chainmail was kind of like his first successful publish that was of note, I suppose. Maybe there was one or two before, but that's the one I know about. And that's kind of what fed into Dave Arneson in Blackmoor. Though I did see it contended that they say they didn't use Chainmail very much, but maybe that's just politics and money trying to say how much it was part of it. I don't know. But Gary Gygax with Chainmail.
What about you, Wally, in terms of Chainmail? Who created that game?
Yeah, to build on that is also Jeff Perren. I don't know anything about him, but I think his name is also on there. With Chainmail in particular, what they had there was a lot of wargaming type stuff in the front, and then Gary kind of just like as an afterthought put like all this medieval stuff in the back, spells, monsters, and things of that nature. And that's what inspired, again, going back to the very first question, with just the building blocks of how D&D became. That was just another building block with having that at the end. But some of the stuff that I found fascinating that was actually in the chainmail that we have today was armor class, where there was certain things that had certain levels of armor, and you would roll dice to try to get that armor class. And one of the things that I've always found fascinating is morale. So in Wargame, there's a lot to do with morale, and this was included in Chainmail, where you would see, if you're commanding armies, if one of your commanders dies, then you make some type of morale check, and then you see if anybody retreats or they keep fighting. But that was when I was playing basic Dungeons and Dragons, again going back to the Back Me Red box. That was part of our monster stat blocks. They would actually say it'd be like Goblin, and it'd have like morale 7. And if something happens, like if Goblin goes in with 6 of his buddies, now there's only 2 buddies, you would roll 2 6-sided dice, and if you get 7, I think it was 7 or higher, then they would run away, or they would do something, they'd surrender. So that's one of the things that I thought was really cool, because I never knew where morale originated from, and it was actually from Gary Gygax and Jeff Perrin's Chainmail set.
What about you, Josiah? When it comes to Chainmail, what do you know? What's your opinion?
I mean, yeah, I feel like as has been said, it's all pretty clear cut. I guess the real question here, and where there's any room for interpretation, is like how much of Gary's work on that was influenced by others. I don't know. I don't think that's something anyone can know. Because yeah, obviously, like, his name is slapped right on it, right? So it's pretty clear cut that he was the primary contributor to that. Yeah, I don't know. I would have loved to know who he was talking to at the time. Because, I mean, if you look at all these people who are kind of all part of the same social group around that time, like, how much of that was borrowed from Arneson or, like, anyone else who was involved at the time of this kind of role-playing renaissance that started to happen with the advent, I guess, of Chainmail, and then following that, D&D and all this other stuff that we're going to talk about. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, and as Wally touched on, like, I know for a fact that the fantasy stuff was Gary Gygax, and that was his kind of standalone contribution to that. And I always found that so weird, because that would be like if we look at the modern Dungeon Master's Guide and found the rules for like sci-fi guns on that one page that's on like page 700 or whatever, way in the back, and a bunch of people were like, let's make a game based off of this, and then that's how we had like Spelljammer 2 or whatever like develop from that. It's such a bizarre thing, because it was just not really like he put it's in the back because he knew that it wasn't something wargamers are going to be interested in, right, for the most part. But like, hey, if you happen to be a wargamer and a Tolkien fan, have I got 3 pages of text for you, so.
What about you, AJ, with regard to Chainmail? Because the discussions about Chainmail and how much it's related to Dungeons and Dragons, they go on and on and on. So
Okay, so this was Jeff Perren's baby, basically. So he developed these mass combat rules because at the time they purchased a big bunch of these Elastilin miniatures, and that gave them, because Dave Arneson was like an only child, had a fairly wealthy family, and a lot of spare time in his hands, and he had the largest collection, a big collection of wargaming miniatures, which was kind of why he was part of that old school group of things, and kind of mover and shaker. You know, the person who shows up with the shiniest toys is quite often the one who's calling the shots. Anyway, so Perren had this big collection of things. He ended up owning a game store himself and hosting a lot of these games and stuff. So when Gary Gygax shows up, Perren's got this rule set that he's developed for mass combat for Castle Bodenberg or Siege Bodenberg or something like that, this particular game that they developed. Then they wanted to develop that as the Chainmail rule set that they published in a magazine, in a fanzine, which was just like a local distribution and stuff. So Gary, again, was focused on publishing a rule set. Let's turn this into a rule set. Let's turn this into a rule set. So he's latching on to creative people and their ideas and saying, we can develop this. We can, he wants to be a publisher. And cynically, you could say he's taking other people's ideas and sticking his name on it and stuff. But I mean, that's what publishers do. Perfect example of that is Kevin Simbita, who has given a lot of people their first published writing gigs, but slaps his name on stuff. And yeah, so the Castle and Crusade Society, and that later developed into. There was Chainmail, which is the one that most people is aware of, and there's also Cavaliers and Roundheads that they've developed as well. So Perren and Gygax had their own deal, and then Gary Gygax and Arneson had their own deal, and that's where Dungeons and Dragons came from. But Castles and Crusades and Chainmail was Perren and Gygax working together, and somewhere in that slew of games and that hodgepodgey 1970s 1971 era, the idea of a campaign, an ongoing campaign, developed as well, because before then war games were just individual battles, and occasionally you would have ongoing battles and stuff that were followed historical lines and things. And one of the problems that Gary Gygax had with other publishers not touching anything fantasy role-playing with a 10-foot barge pole is because it was a game that had a very complicated set of rules but no end to the game. Nobody won. And they just were like, what's the point of that? What kid is going to want to read all these rules and then play this game that just never ends and never has a resolution? They just didn't get it. They had no idea what they were dealing with. And one of the things with... that's enough answer, I think.
Yeah, no. But that covers that pretty well. I mean, absolutely. Jeff Perren apparently did 4 pages of notes or rules. I don't know whether it was handwritten or typed or anything like that. It doesn't sort of indicate that. And Gary expanded that. I think it was to 50 or 60 pages.
Yeah. You see the original entries for monsters and stuff like that, where there was no lore attached to them. They were just basically stats for wargaming.
Yeah. So I don't really have anything else to add because you pretty much covered everything, AJ. So next question, and that is, like, now that we've got a lot of the background, we're now getting into like the nuts and bolts of role-play games, which is Dungeons and Dragons, which I still think is hugely interesting. And the only reason this question is here is because of the fun story that this question brings up. Regarding how it all happened, if you remember or know anything about it, and that is like how was the first fantasy role play game born or conceived? Like, who really conceived of it, and how did they conceive of it? It's a fun story. So Jordan, what did you have for us?
What I read was that Dave Arneson's Blackmoor game, one day he dropped in a Star Trek phaser for the druid or something like that, and then they put the fantasy and role-playing all of a sudden. Arguably it could have been when there was a dragon involved, I guess, but as far as I could tell, it arrived from that introduction of just something completely unhistorical, genre bending almost, so fantasy role playing was born in that moment, or at least that's what they attributed it to from what I read.
What about you, Wally? In terms of like, how was the fantasy role playing born or created?
I'm not sure if I have the answer that you are referring to, so I'm going to just give a little bit of opinion and let Josiah tackle that one after me. But what I did find fascinating is when they, so a little bit off topic, but not much, is when they started to do this, that some of their play group were like, yeah, we don't like this. And so they went from wargaming, and then they started getting these wargaming sessions with a little bit of role playing. And then a couple of them like, yeah, we don't want to do this. We're out. And we're like, well, this is the game we're going to play. So either play it or not. And they would actually have players leave the table and other ones join, depending on whether or not they liked this aspect that they were adding to their game.
Josiah, you fantasy role playing born. How was it conceived? What's your opinion on this one?
Yeah, I don't think I was able to find what the story you're talking about. So I feel like you should tell it because you seem more intimately familiar with it. But I guess my takeaway from this question was basically that it it's no secret that Gygax and probably a lot of these folks were big fans of Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings. And I think it kind of just came from that desire to like, okay, like you have all the building blocks, right? Like we have our war game, we have rules for combat. Okay, now we're looking at playing individual characters. Like, okay, what's that like? And just kind of that desire to do the cool stuff that's the cool characters you like in cool books we're doing, you know what I mean? And like, just, I think that really is what it comes down to, is the need and desire to develop rules to have fun with, because I think that's, as adults, like just when you're a kid, you can just be running outside fucking hitting stuff with a stick and being like, oh, I'm having the best time ever, I'm a knight. And it's like, okay, when you're an adult, you're like, well, that's silly. But if we have rules for how that works, then it's believable to me. You know? Like if I have to roll a dice and get at least a 14 to hit a thing with a stick, then I can feel cool because I feel like I've earned it, you know? So I think that it just came from that desire to want to play in much the way that like a young kid might, but without having access to tools to make it more believable and to give it stakes and to, I guess stakes really is what it comes down to, is because for most adults, like you need there to be stakes in order for something to have fun or to be fun, right? Like if you watch an epic moment happen in a movie, but you didn't see the first hour leading up to that, you're like, well, that looks cool, but I don't really care. But if you watch the whole thing, you're like, oh, now I actually care because I understand what the stakes are here and like why that matters, right? So yeah, just in a general sense, I would say that's where it spawned from, but I'm anticipating this story.
I'm waiting for the story, and AJ is the story. AJ, what have you got for us?
More like a it's a reoccurring theme that's part of the social contract of Dungeons and Dragons and role playing games in general. So whenever you have and this was back when I first started playing RPGs, there was this young guy Wes who was a couple of years younger than us in school, you know, and he was into role-playing games in a big way, but we just we didn't want a kid sitting at our table and playing with us, you know, and so he would go off and he'd write his own RPG stuff based on, you know, he would glean whatever he could from what we were doing, and he would steal pictures of monsters and maps and things like that from us, and he ran 3-day long marathons out in the bush. You know, his friends would bike 4K out into the Coromandel bush into a shack and stay there all night playing D&D. We didn't do anything like that, you know, so that was way more intense, and he developed a very unique hard method of play where he psychologically damaged some of his friends. You know, if he didn't reduce them to tears at least once, he wasn't doing his job right. Had this whole cult mythos of you know, you got to do the hard yards to earn the levels and things like that, whereas we would just barely even have characters that would last 1 or 2 sessions. So in a way, It was the same thing with Dave Arneson. He was part of the Twin City Gaming Group. They were into their historical reenactment of Napoleonic warfare. He had the biggest set of miniatures, so he got his foot in the door, and he was very interested in the diplomacy aspect of it and stuff that Wesely had developed. And then when the cat's away, he also had his own groups of like upcoming high school students who were getting into it and things like that. And that was where these fantasy games came in, because he literally had a falling out with these traditional Napoleonic role players, wargamers, who said, "No, I'm not interested. I don't want to like run that game." So when he shows up at the house and or the gaming shop or whatever, or the convention thingy, and a bunch of these old school guys don't want to play the game that he's running, and so he doesn't get any players at the table, sort of thing, that really encourages you to go off and develop your own sideline and your own group and stuff. And so where he wasn't very comfortable telling these older gamers and stuff what to do, when he was in the room with the newer gamers, he was the old school, came from the traditional roots, part of the Twin City Gamers, guy with all the toys, calling the shots, dungeon master. So they accepted him being the referee and narrating rules and things like that and telling them what the game was going to be way more than the original group did. And that was what the genesis of Blackmoor and the Banana Republic game and Dungeons and Dragons, that was the genesis of it, was Dave Arneson being the first dungeon master.
So there's a lot of really cool stories around this, and they all sort of play a part. And it's like what I saw was Dave Wesely's running his Braunstein, and then Dave Arneson takes over when he leaves. And he was apparently bored one day and decided to add a magic user onto one of the armies, who then proceeded to obliterate the other side. This was him just sort of getting bored and integrating like just fantasy elements to a game which was supposed to be sort of like kind of like a reproduction of an old war, but it's not really, because most of those were just like trying to reenact the war. Not really, they want to do it better than it was done before, essentially. And then he also said, like, I got really bored. I was getting frustrated with wargaming. Even Braunstein really didn't sort of appeal at that at a point, and he decided to eat a lot of junk food, popcorn, soda, and sat down and
a movie marathon. Yeah,
he had a monster movie marathon for a couple of days and read a lot of Conan the Barbarian, and Howard is very much responsible for Dave Arneson and also Gary Gygax interest in fantasy. They were very big influences. Apparently Gary didn't really like Lord of the Rings very much.
Yeah.
He included it because people wanted it in there just to sell.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Lord of the Rings was old by the time that, Tolkien died in 1973. So, the Lord of the Rings was old. It was originally, it's a lot of stuff grew out of it, but role-playing games were not based solely on that. I mean, that was, hobbits and things like that came from it, and that was the terminology that they used. But like the Vancian magic system in Dungeons and Dragons and all that sort of stuff, though, that was not, there's no magic system in Lord of the Rings.
The Lord of the Rings was your like mass appeal, right? Like, I don't know, it's like if you're making a tabletop game in current year and you're like, cool, there are minions in it for the kids. Yeah. A little something for, just general mass appeal. And because a lot of the old school games were really like sword and sorcery heavy, which is where you can see that like Conan inspiration, right? Where it's like, like just brutal settings and rules. Like you said, AJ, you were going through like one or two characters every couple of weeks. It's like, yeah, that was normal. You had a character get to level 6, you're like, huh, the DM must have fucked up or gone easy on us if I made it to level 6. Like,
Yeah, there's no milestone system back then. It was like you earned the XP through killing things and taking loot and stuff.
Get the gold.
Yeah.
So there's another thing I think Dave Arneson said when he was developing the fantasy role-playing game, and that was that, it was a natural development. The community was going that way anyway, and I think he had said something like kids have been pretend playing for years, hundreds of years. He's just taking it into a different form. rather than it being running around on a field or in the forest or whatever else that AJ was just describing. They took it to the table, and and it was for a slightly older generation rather than the younger generation. Although, as we discover, the younger generation certainly played a lot of that. Did you want to add something, Wally? All right. So now we're getting into the questions, which are kind of a bit more about Gary and Dave, because kind of need to understand a little bit more about them. We've kind of explained a lot. So I guess the question I have is, why do you think people believe Gary Gygax created Dungeons and Dragons and sort of forget that Dave Arneson is very much a part and parcel of this whole process? It's an unfortunate development, and I would like to think that it wasn't a product of some pressure, but people have their opinions. So why do you think people think Gary Gygax is pretty much the only one responsible for creating Dungeons and Dragons? Jordan?
So there's a few reasons that it could be. Maybe it's because people who are a little bit older into the hobby maybe saw it as he took the most risks, and so he became like the figurehead and that sort of thing. But speaking for myself, who really came into the hobby casually through video games like Baldur's Gate when I was growing up, and I didn't really sit down and roll dice with people. It was just like video games. When I actually started playing 5e, that's when I really got into it. Didn't know anything about the history of Dungeons and Dragons, and I learned about Gary Gygax through social media and memes. That's why people believe that Gary Gygax is like the only person involved. Futurama didn't help either, because they had him like do a cameo, and he's like, "I'm Gary Gygax." He didn't say that. I haven't seen the episode, but and then his name is just behind the actual branding of it. So I think it's just the most easily accessible information. But I think memes is the big thing, and social media memes that writes history now. So that's where I thought it was him.
What about you, Wally? Why do you think people think Gary is the guy who created Dungeons and Dragons exclusively?
I do find it interesting that memes for newer players, that's really cool. I would never have considered that. For me, I mean, there's a slew of reasons that I would think. Jordan had mentioned there being the front man. I mean, he is the one he's the main one trying to get Dungeons and Dragons published, trying to get his name out there. I mean, he was making shoes in his basement. He wants to do anything but that. He wants to, so he's working hard and he's putting his name out there and things. And it'll give him recognition. He wrote a lot of things. He wrote in magazines. He helped publish a lot of books. So his name is on more D&D books than Dave Arneson's name is. Honestly, Gary Gygax is not a name that you're going to forget. I mean, if somebody to say Gary Gygax or Dave Arneson, it's just, I don't know. Yeah, it's a catchy name. And not only that, but I mean, for a long time too, Gary's kids are involved in a lot, and they're keeping their father's, name alive. They've got, his last name. They're out there. You've got Gary Con, for, in memory of him. You've got, Gen Con, which he helped start. So Gary helped stir the pudding quite a bit. He put his fingers in there. He got things going, and he got his names out there. And if you have a front person like that, I mean, pretty much the speaker of D&D, people are going to remember them first.
What about you, Josiah? What do you think people think?
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, especially that memes informed a lot of new players. And I think that's true because unfortunately in the cartoon apocalypse we currently find ourselves living in, memes do inform history. And that's maybe the worst sentence I've ever said, but here we are. I think that's all very relevant. I also think a big part of it was he fucking told everybody that he did. That's a big part of the reason why people think Gary Gygax invented Dungeons and Dragons, because when you hear the topic of Dungeons and Dragons, you go, "Oh, you mean the game I made?" Yeah, so that's a pretty neat part of the whole equation here. I think that might even be the biggest reason why people think Gary Gygax invented. Which, I mean, isn't to say that I haven't seen every interview or every record with him. I don't think that there was ever a point where he was like, Dave Arneson isn't a real person. You guys are crazy. But I do think that like he would take credit for things when he could. And like, in a lot of the cases it was deserved for sure. It's not like Gary Gygax was just some fucking guy who just like showed up and got paid, you know. Like he was very responsible for a lot of this stuff. But I do think that especially given that him and Dave had that falling out, like he wasn't going to go out of his way to tell people, oh, I can't take all the credit. My ex friend Dave, who I hate now, also did some of this stuff too. You know what I mean? So I think that's definitely a big contributing factor for sure.
What about you, AJ? What do you think people consider Gary the creator of Dungeons and Dragons?
So I would say that from advanced Dungeons and Dragons onwards, Gary Gygax is Dungeons and Dragons. Not let's not forget that also the 20-sided dice and the 12-sided dice and stuff that we play with today that are so iconic to the game were Gary Gygax. He brought that to the game, and so that was not Dave Arneson. That was Gary Gygax. So the crux, the kernel of what Dungeons and Dragons is now was Gary Gygax's baby, mostly. He got there on the shoulders of other people who were developing things through playtesting, you know, through playing the game and developing these rule sets for their ongoing games and stuff, but they weren't interested in publishing. He was working in the publishing industry. He was an insurance underwriter. He was a high school dropout. He did cobbling to you know, shoes and stuff to make the ends meet, but he was a publisher. He ended up leaving the first publishing company that he was with, which was I can't remember the name of it.
Gridiron?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, and he approached Avalon Hill, but he didn't realize that Avalon Hill was like two people in the back shed of a publishing company. So he developed TSR, and he needed to get this game organized and published, and he developed Gen Con. So Gen Con was very much was very much Gary Gygax, and popularizing and getting the word out, and then it taking off, and he realized what it was. Dave Arneson, I think, didn't realize, and the group of gamers who were involved in this homebrewing and stuff didn't realize that they had produced something extraordinary, and really latched onto it, because people didn't understand it. Like, you can write down the rules of a role-playing game and hand it to somebody, and they will not understand what role-playing is unless, like, the front section of any role-playing book that you get has a description of play of what role-playing is. The rules don't encapsulate that. The make-believe aspect of Dungeons and Dragons was that first example of play, and so the drive and stuff, and the success lands on the shoulders of Gary Gygax, and he's running with it, and he's producing new material for it as fast as he possibly can, and he's developing international contacts and stuff like that with Games Workshop and Steve Livingstone and Jackson over in the UK. He's developing contacts with miniature producers to produce fantasy miniatures that didn't exist. You know, he had to use dinosaurs and things like that. Hence why we've got boulets and rust monsters and these weird looking creatures. So he's developing all this sort of stuff, and Dave Arneson is in the background, and he's running war games and running the Blackmoor game and stuff, and he's popping in every now and then, but he's a terrible typist. He's not really involved in the publishing aspect of it and stuff, and so Gygax is taking on and doing all the work. And of course, in his mind, that means I'm taking all the profits because I'm doing all the actual work and stuff. And he didn't really give Dave Arneson the intellectual percentage that he was probably due, and that ended up going to court, and that's when all of these documents and stuff got dragged out, and it became a matter of public record that a lot of the original Dungeons and Dragons was Dave Arneson's work. But from AD&D and the Fiend Folio and stuff onwards, that was all Gary Gygax, and you can see that reflected in Dragon Magazine articles, editorials and stuff. Yeah, where just his name is appearing, and Dave Arneson slips out of the scene and gets relegated to history. But it's a history that I'm quite happy to bring forward and to tell people about in the modern day. But is it that relevant to the modern game? Nah, neither of their names are on Dungeons and Dragons now.
That's
sadly.
True. So for me, I guess I think one of the biggest things you discover when it comes to Gary and Dave is that both of them really wanted this rule set out there and it to be used. And there was really a time factor because they had a lot of people playtesting it. And what happened is that because Gary's much faster typer than Dave Arneson, and Dave Arneson was actually using somebody else.
Gaylord.
Yeah, Gail doing a lot of the typing for him, and he's handwriting.
So she had the first set of D&D rules ever.
That's true.
Lady.
Yeah, she was probably faster than Gary, actually. But the thing that I find interesting is that Gary was able to get a draft for this game out, and they were worried that somebody else would pick it up and that all the stuff they'd already done would be taken by somebody else. And Gary said, I'm going to start putting it together. Now, Dave Arneson's also doing his own thing, but it took him a year after D&D was actually published to get his final draft done, which is actually somewhat different to Gary's one. And this is why there was a lot of arguing between Dave and Gary. And I think this is part of the reason why Gary has sort of decided it's his thing, and why a lot of people, because he did say to people, it's my thing. But he had to agree, if you got him in the right place and in the corner, yeah, Dave is responsible for an awful lot of the conceptual stuff. Absolutely, that's the case. But he definitely was very much responsible for the first draft and writing the first books. And he's very much a businessman. And surprisingly, I mean, even though a lot of bad things happened along the way, he made some very bad decisions, absolutely. But he's also a game designer and a businessman at the same time. And it's hard to do both well all the time. And
establishing a whole new branch of publishing industry, a whole new gaming industry.
He put his own money forward. He got his buddy, Don Kaye, to put money forward. They had to get another funder in, which wound up being Brian Blume. And as a result of that, he's really was the spearhead to make sure that this got out there before somebody else took it. So I can kind of see why a lot of people view Gary as the guy who did it. He's just part of the cog. He certainly probably suffered more than Dave Arneson did from the whole process of trying to get Dungeons and Dragons out there in the world, because it was very turbulent for him. Some of it not really his fault, and just a product of other people trying to claim stuff themselves, and also a product of his own frailties and failures along the way. And it's
like you could argue who owns more percentage of something, who's due more, the person who's intellectually responsible for it or the person who's financially responsible for it.
Yeah, exactly. Now, the next question we've got is, and I think this is probably my bit that I like the most, and that is, what do you think are the aspects of Dungeons and Dragons, the game, that Dave Arneson developed and brought into the game? Like, what do you, in terms of your understanding, what did he bring into the game of Dungeons and Dragons? Jordan?
To me, it seems like he kind of pioneered the dungeon delving fantasy part of it. And then, like, rules, and especially, like, once we get to AD&D, like, Gary was more that part. But Dave Arneson, I would say, because his Blackmoor thing was basically, here's a castle, go explore it. There's a bunch of fantasy pieces to it, and so to me that was his main contribution. But I haven't seen all the notes and stuff between him and Gary about like what he actually codified and developed. Maybe some of the other guys know more about that.
Yeah, thank you, Jordan. Wally, what do you think Dave Arneson brought to Dungeons and Dragons?
You're muted.
Straight answer, I'm going to say I'm muted. But factual answer, or at least what I believe to be factual answer, would be the big ones, which Jordan just said, is dungeon delving with Blackmoor, and also hit points and leveling characters up. Those are some of the big aspects where previously your characters didn't level up. They were just who they were. Would you go as far to say that, he also did a lot with playtesting? I mean, because, he didn't, played a lot with Blackmoor. He had these tables together. Yeah, actually, I think I'm going to quit there. I'm going to listen to what the rest of you guys say, because I think I'm good with that answer.
That's all right. What about you, Josiah? what did Dave Arneson bring to Dungeons and Dragons?
I think Dave Arneson's biggest contribution to Dungeons and Dragons was completely torpedoing the concept of balance within a war game. I think that, like, famously, Gary Gygax hated spellcasters. I mean, not hated, but was concerned about, like, the wizard because it had a lot of potential to become very powerful very fast, so he was trying to do a lot to rein that in. And Dave Arneson famously, like, there's one of the most famous anecdotes whenever this topic comes up is the whole magic missile thing, right? Where, like, Dave Arneson was like, you got to give the wizards at least one thing that they can do that will, like, always works. They're just like, fine, fucking magic missile, whatever, like, that's their go-to. How much truth there is to that, I don't know. A lot of that stuff is anecdotal, and it's not like Gary Gygax sent Dave Arneson a letter that said, by the way, I don't really like magic users, you know? Like, a lot of this is based off of conversations that they've had with other people. So I don't really know, but based on rumor, I guess, which is what a lot of this stuff comes down to, aside from the things that are just straight up codified and written down. I feel like Dave Arneson probably had a lot to do with what magic looked like in D&D, and I guess for better or for worse, how a lot of that stuff turned out. Some of the more fantastical arcane elements, I suppose.
Oh yeah, because didn't he also pull something like the concept from a book series of, like, the wizard, like, casting spells and then forgetting it, so they have to, like, prepare it again? I think I remember reading that.
You're talking about
like the
magic.
Vancian magic, yeah. I don't know if that was Dave Arneson or not. I don't know.
AJ, what about yourself? What do you think Dave Arneson brought into the game of Dungeons and Dragons and its development?
It's almost impossible to say because they like the Blackmoor was responsible for, like, Dave demonstrating Blackmoor to Gary Gygax immediately had him, like, type up a 50-page rule set thingy. Then he went and developed his own Greyhawk campaign with his two kids, and then a bunch of other people who ended up playing in that one as well. And at some point he published his Greyhawk version of the rules without consultation with Arneson on the final draft of it. And so that's where that difference between the two comes in. So Gygax's influence of, like, Vancian magic and that sort of thing was in that sort of rule set. So I don't know. I'm not privy to Arneson's original version of Dungeons and Dragons. It will be handwritten notes somewhere, and the original castle. I mean, the original Castle Blackmoor campaign is still around. You can download a PDF of it for free. You can find it on the internet. So it's still there, and it's still being played to this day. And that has a different set of rules for things. So you can see the nuts and bolts that went into making Dungeons and Dragons in that. And answer it for yourself. But yeah, for me, Gary Gygax really developed the idea of the magic system and leveling campaigns and that sort of stuff. And yeah, I think it culminated in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and the errata, the first errata for the Unearthed Arcana that brought us, like, the assassin class and things like that. That sort of thing was already sort of informally in the Blackmoor campaign, but it wasn't really codified. People played individual characters based on their personality and their behavior and what they wanted to do, but I don't think they were really character classes at the time. And that's what was codified and written into the rules with Gygax.
And real quick, if I can interject, what's the term we've been using? Vancian magic? I'm not familiar. What is that? That's
the fire and forget version of. So you memorize a spell, cast it, and then it's wiped from your mind.
And did I get Vancian?
Vancian, yeah. Jack Vance wrote the Dying Earth fantasy series, fantasy sci-fi series of a far advanced Earth. It's like Dark Sun is kind of like the baby of that. I don't know, kind of ish.
Okay, Vancian, got it.
Yeah. Actually, Numenera is really the baby of that, because Numenera is takes this idea of a far, far, far future Earth where there's been multiple civilizations rise and fall.
So when I was looking at this question myself, I had to pull it from Dave Arneson's daughter, and what she had to say, and his Blackmoor group, who were involved in quite a extensive interview process, and some of the stuff that he'd written down or he said himself in interviews. And as far as I can tell, there's some very key conceptual things that it seems that Dave Arneson brought to this. And I would say the concept of a group of characters adventuring together. And apparently his daughter says that was from Star Trek. He loved the idea of a group of individuals in Star Trek going down to a planet and exploring a place together. And so that's why Dungeons and Dragons is always about the group rather than a single solitary character. It's a group of characters. Another thing that it's clear that he sort of brought in, and that was the concept of, as AJ has said, character attributes, which didn't initially start off being, they didn't start off as being strength, dexterity, intelligence. They were called something else. They were very, very different. The names for those changed. And there was a lot of stuff that he was doing that was clearly there was no rules. He was just making stuff up as he went. And it really wasn't a hack and slash. It was very much it's a free form game. I guess if you're a streamer and you love playing online and you never use the rules, you'd probably have no problems hanging out with Dave, because that was kind of what he was doing. He did a lot of research into mazes, which is where the dungeons came in. A lot of theory around mazes. Castles and leading armies was a big factor for him. But even with Blackmoor and Blackmoor Castle, there was a lot of adventuring taking place outside of that. His group was saying, like, he would develop the whole fantasy world. It wasn't just the dungeon underneath the castle or the castle itself. There's all the stuff surrounding it. They could go there as well. They went where they wanted to go. And the concept of adventuring and different goals, which we kind of talked about, very much the concept of role-playing a character. A lot of exploration, as Jordan has mentioned. Monsters. There's a lot of discussion about interactions with monsters, and apparently one of his first players had to deal with a troll under a bridge, and that player did not get to roll any dice. It just died. That character went under the bridge, found the troll.
He left the game because of that. He was like, "But I'm the hero. Why? I can't just get killed by a troll." It's like, well, you didn't realize the troll was regenerating and you get killed. And he's like, "Fuck this!" Off he goes.
So this is early development and trying to figure out what to do with it. The concept of prizes. Dave Arneson certainly understood the idea of giving out loot and prizes of some kind, objectives, character leveling. He incorporated into his game a lot of sci-fi and time travel, and his concept of magic and magic spells was very unbalanced. There was not a decision to sort of include something that was like game balanced, because I don't think it's clear from early on that he was all about throwing out all of that sort of stuff completely, and anything could possibly happen. So I think there's a lot of aspects to it, and AJ's point on the character classes, I think that's where the character classes came from. I think they came from Dave Arneson. He may not have codified them, but they were all pretty much being play tested in that Blackmoor group. So that's my understanding of.
Because the attribute system that we have today is a work of genius. If you actually look at the game science behind it, like strength is pretty easy to understand. It's pounds lifted and things like that. But like dexterity is nerve conductivity speed, and how that contributes to both your agility, your reaction speed, and also how graceful you are. Because the faster your nerve conductivity speed is, the more micro adjustments you can make per movement. So it goes from being to a smooth and graceful action. So things like that, and like how do you like IQ divided into 20 points is difficult. But yeah, all the attribute stuff is really a work of genius.
I guess the question that has to be brought to forward, and we've kind of covered some of this, so feel free to jump past anything you feel is a repeat of what you've said. What aspects of Dungeons and Dragons do you think Gary brought into the game, in terms of the game itself? We obviously know he was very much a businessman, and put a lot of his own money into the game as well. Jordan, what do you think?
I think that was the main contribution that I'm educated about, is just his business acumen and decisions. I don't know so much about how to delineate his own ideas from other people's. Maybe others will know about more about that, like before. But I think his big thing was just coming up with good branding. I think he was the one that came up with Dungeons and Dragons. I think he like floated the different like alliteration names to his kids with like a list of like 20 to like 50 different words and just tried them out. So good for him for good branding. King of alliteration, Gary Gygax, Dungeons and Dragons. So he's a meme king, is what he is. That's what he made Dungeons and Dragons stand the test of time with his finesse of the business and perpetuating it not just beyond one edition, but going further and then eventually getting pushed out of his own company. So those were his main contributions I'm aware of.
Mm-hmm. Wally, what about you? What did Gary Gygax bring to Dungeons and Dragons in terms of its development?
My answer on this again is I don't really want to say non-factual things because I did do some research trying to figure out. I was looking at these two questions: what did Dave Arneson develop? What did Gary develop? I didn't really find like a definitive list, like column A is Dave and column B is Gary, and I would say that in the beginning, Gary did more refining than he did developing. He took ideas and made them better, or came up with alternate ideas or things like that. That until you get to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which, if I understand correctly, the Dungeon Master Guide for First Edition AD&D had a lot of stuff that he came up with, either stuff that he'd previously written in magazines. I think he included like just some off-the-wall charts in there. I guess there's information that Gary put in that First Edition AD&D book, Dungeon Master Guide, that's just like, what the heck is going on? And this is cool. How can I use it? But yeah, so I don't really know a definitive list. So my answer would be that he did probably bring quite a few things, but he was also able to refine a lot of ideas.
What about you, Josiah? What did Gary Gygax bring?
My understanding has always been that Gary Gygax has contributed like literal piles of rules, and I don't even mean that as a bad thing. Like that, like that's what he did. Was he just tried to come up with systems and rules for everything, and it was like, okay, here's a thing, publish that, cool. Here's a thing, publish that, like, and that's why when you get to the advent of AD&D, it was like, all right, so let's take the 10,000 rules Gary came up with and cut that down to like the most essential and well thought out 10%, and then continue, and then make a shit ton of rules again, iterating off of like that new base, right? So I feel like that's always been my understanding, is that Gary was largely responsible for a lot of the rules and like tables, like Wally mentioned, and systems that were in place.
What about you, AJ? What do you think Gary brought to the development of Dungeons and Dragons?
Satanism, misogyny, and greed.
Right, rules and systems.
Yeah. So put that on a t-shirt. So yeah, not being too cynical, but he did bring a lot of the worst aspects of the publishing industry to it. But I mean, with that, he brought all the players. So he brought the public into the little group of wargamers, and that's why the game exploded as it did. Let's not forget that his original partner, one of the original 1/3 share partners, died of a heart attack unexpectedly at a young age. That was Kaye. And his wife was not interested in Dungeons and Dragons or running a business at all, and basically dumped all of the stuff out on the front porch and said, "Get this shit out of my house." And that's when Gary Gygax took it to his basement and founded TSR. And so he had to deal with that. Arneson didn't, and so he was dealing with the business side of it from the outset, and a lot of stress. He had to deal with the satanic panic. We can't forget that as well. So he had to deal with the kickback from the public about role-playing games, and the lack of understanding they had about what role-playing games actually were. Of course, the established religious authorities at the time didn't like anybody muscling in on the realm of imagination, and so they kicked back against Dungeons and Dragons a lot, and that's a whole nother video. Yeah, so he brought, I think, a lot of the non-gaming aspects of Dungeons and Dragons, the publishing aspect of it, and things like that were really, his main contributions, I think. But yeah, also, I've got to say, he did a lot of harm to women playing the game through his comments and stuff about, he was a biological determinist and things like that, and the fact that women were playing RPGs from the very outset should have been like shouted from the fucking rooftops from the very beginning. And a lot of what Gary Gygax said in his editorials and stuff in Dragon Magazine should be rightfully vilified.
Some of those are miserable. Like, there's ones that basically start out with like, so if you're one of them ones with the boobs, like, it's wild, dude. It is the most cringy, embarrassing shit you've ever seen in a publication.
Yeah. So yeah, don't get us old school gamers wrong. We love Gary Gygax and we celebrate Gary Gygax Day, and we he's almost a religious figure and things like that. We'd erect statues to him, but we're also very realistic about the damage that has been done to the hobby as a result of his actions.
I think for me, one of the things that Gary Gygax brought to the development of Dungeons and Dragons in the game is very much the mechanics, because a lot of what Dave Arneson was doing really didn't have a lot of hard, fast rules, and I think Gary was more a rules person than Dave Arneson was, and it's, I don't think it's necessarily because Gary wanted to play with a whole lot of rules, because that doesn't seem to be the case if you look at history. It's about presenting it to the that's right. How do you present a game to somebody that suddenly has almost no rules? Like, why would you even buy it? So he had to make rules and mechanics that would appeal to the public to sell the product, rather than say, just do what you want and make believe at a table with some dice. Like, that's it. So you can't sell that. So I think mechanics, the combat system, I think is very much an aspect that he's contributed to. Refinement, as Josiah said. I think was it Dave Arneson has mentioned on many times, he was a pretty fast typist, so certainly being able to type out things really quickly was very helpful for Dungeons and Dragons and the constant barrage of adventures. And Gary wrote a lot of adventures, and some very good ones, some that people do not like, and some that are actually stand the test of time and actually incorporate things that are surprisingly interesting. And the inclusion of baby goblins and child goblins that adventurers have to deal with in the Caves of Chaos is a good example of having to make that moral dilemma decision. He did that sort of thing. A lot of them did, actually, but he certainly incorporated it into his adventures. Vancing Magic, definitely a pretty solid businessman, just too much going on. Finding all the funding for this was very difficult for him. But yes, I think very much the drive to get the rule system out there and write it up physically, and also put in mechanics that you could actually sell a product, were kind of his thing. Okay, so we've got another question, and that is like, there's actually a lot of other people who were responsible, and we've kind of covered a lot of this. So if we've covered it already, feel free to jump past this. Like, who else do you think originally helped create and develop Dungeons and Dragons? We've kind of talked a lot about this, but if there's anybody we've missed, feel free to add them. So Jordan, I'll start with you.
I just took note of some other early wargamers, Don Kaye and Brian Blume. I don't know anything about you guys, but thanks.
Shouts out.
Yeah, so Don Kaye was Gary Gygax's best friend and helped fund it. And Brian Blume was also an avid tabletop wargamer and loved the game as well. And he was in. He was so in that he was willing to get his own money into the adventure. And I believe initially it was about $2,000. And back then that's a lot of money. So I think he put in about twice as much as the other two when the need was required. So they had a big influence. So absolutely. What about you, Wally?
Well, if I were to attach a third name to Arneson and Gygax, it would be David Wesely, who we already talked about. So I do want to give a kind of a creative answer to this, and that is going to be the playtesters. Because if it wasn't for the playtesters going through the game, having the interest in it, we wouldn't have a lot of the stuff that we have today. And I think I remember one of the documentaries I was watching that Gary Gygax would actually field phone calls from people that had questions when the original D&D first came out. They had questions about how the rules were, and so Gary would be like, "Yeah, Gary Gygax, what can I help you with?" And he would answer that and be like, "Well, how do you think that it should go, or what would you do?" I mean, kind of like we do today with our homebrewing and stuff. And so I have no doubts that Gary probably took a lot of those ideas that, they responded to him. Well, this is the way I see it. Like, yeah, that sounds pretty good. You should do that. And he probably took a lot of those ideas as influencing for his future, Dungeons and Dragons products.
Josiah, what about you? Who else do you think originally helped in the development of Dungeons and Dragons? Who have we missed?
I think the only people who have only been briefly mentioned that are deserving of being mentioned is Gary's children. Half of them grew up to be really cool. Most of them, even.
Yeah. Fair.
All of them but one, really. That's all I'm going to say about that.
Yeah. So for those of you who don't know, Gary Gygax actually used his kids as playtesters and his best friends. But I believe Ernest was one of his sons. He was involved in playing the game. So was Luke. Luke still plays. I believe Alex, later on, he had Alex. He had 3 girls, and they all played for quite a while. Yep. I believe Elise played from the very get-go, and later on was more interested in boys. And then Cindy's the one who picked the name Dungeons and Dragons that you were mentioning, Jordan. She's the one. He said, here's some names or words. What do you like? And she said Dungeons and Dragons. I like those words, and so they got put together. And then also Heidi was also part of that. I believe Heidi and Cindy decided that they didn't really want to play anymore when Luke took over from dungeon mastering. So, sorry, Luke. I love to meet you, but apparently your 2 sisters had enough. Gary found this apparently very amusing from the biography that I was listening to. What have you got for us?
Can I throw something in on that there, Fred? Can I add something to that? Yeah. So 2 things, and the one that I'm kind of sure of, I'll mention first, and the second one I want to ask you a question. So the first thing is in 2020, before the pandemic happened, I was really excited because I was going to go to GaryCon, and I was in one of the Gygax's games. So I just I might have been Heidi. I think it was one of the girls or one of his daughters that I was going to is going to be with one of them. I was so excited. And then of course 2020 happened and it got canceled. So for those of you that do live in the Midwest and you get a chance to go to GaryCon, they sell out really quick. But there's actually a chance to actually play with one of the Gygax children. Speaking of which, you had mentioned, I think it was Ernest and Elise that were playing. And if I'm not mistaken, I think one of those characters was Tinser, which we have that filtered through some of the spells. So my question for you, is there any other kids, did they have some of their characters immortalized that way? Because that's the only one I found.
I think so, yeah.
Yes, there is actually another one. I believe Luke had... it's the acid arrow. What's the name of that acid arrow? Melf. Yeah, that was his character. Melf.
Okay.
Was Luke's character. So a lot of the kids' characters actually wound up finding their way into spells because apparently Gary would let them make up some of their own spells along the way. So for those of you who thought that Gary was only about mechanics, when it came to running his own games, like anything might happen potentially.
Yeah. Like one of the originally playtesters wanted to play a Wild West type character, so he had 6-shooter guns that ran on magic, and stuff. So guns have always been a part of D&D.
Yeah. That's why at our D&D table we call it Shithead's Floating Disc. So we call it at our table.
Oh dear. AJ,
It's somewhat unfair, but hey.
let's keep going. I don't know.
Okay, so the main one that I want to do a shout out to is J. Eric Holmes, who came up with the D&D basic box set, because that was what got me into D&D. When I saw that red box set sitting on the Woolworths shelf, and I begged my grandmother for the $11 to buy it, which was an enormous amount of money at the time. That was what started my lifelong obsession with D&D. I didn't actually start playing until a couple of years later, but yeah, the solo play game, Damn You Bargle, was what really hooked me into it. So that and like the Choose Your Own Adventure books was what sort of got me hooked into. That was like the weed that got me hooked into the. I started mainlining D&D afterwards. But also the Blume, the Kuntz brothers, Terry Kuntz and Rob Kuntz, were part of the original playtesting group that Gary Gygax ran. That grew to about 20 people in his basement. But I really, J. Eric Holmes' visionary idea of coming up with a basic play set that incorporated all that sort of stuff really was a huge contributor. I'd also like to give a shout out to what's his name? Egbert, who James Dallas Egbert III, who went off the deep end and that was responsible for the whole Satanic Panic thing, and also Tom Hanks for being a complete sellout schmuck and making that Mazes and Monsters movie, which was absolute trash, but it got us the public attention and really, the controversy that was the Satanic Panic was both a bane and a thorn in the side of everybody who played the game, including myself for many years, but also drove that public awareness of what D&D was and made it a household name so that everybody who knows role-playing games knows and calls it D&D to this day.
How many actual Satanists do you think went out and bought the red box after that and then were immensely disappointed that it didn't actually summon demons?
It's like the magic system is wrong!
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh dear. I think that the Blackmoor group of playtesters was quite extensive. That was quite a large group, and there were actually more than one, and I believe that Dave Arneson wasn't the only one running Blackmoor. So there was more than one Blackmoor group, actually. But one of the names that comes up, and the problem with Duane Jenkins is because you can't really ask him very much. When they were able to talk to him, his memory was gone. But one of the things he did mention was Brownstone, which was basically a role-play Western, which he ran kind of a little bit after Blackmoor was developed. It was kind of his thing. It never really took off, but a lot of people who played in that game do remember it. Yeah,
he's responsible for the idea of an ongoing campaign. So that was his contribution to role-playing games in general.
And then there are the hundreds, maybe thousands of people who ran the game before it was published and played in those games, because they all gave feedback, and that informed Gary and even Dave Arneson in terms of what they may need to change, because it's not like they had anything to work with to start with. They really.
I wouldn't say it was hundreds and thousands. I'd say it was handfuls.
I would say it's probably more in the hundred maybe range rather than. Maybe it's less. I mean, who knows? I don't know.
Who knows?
And nobody actually knows exactly, because nobody ever said anything too much about like who actually received those first drafts before the publication.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've dealt with an awful lot, and unfortunately, if we've kind of already talked about it a little bit, there's a point where Gary and Dave Arneson had a falling out over the ownership, really, of Dungeons and Dragons. And what people don't realize is actually this falling out happened many times. It wasn't just with Gary and Dave Arneson, it was actually with TSR and Dave Arneson, and actually bled on to all of their other game developers throughout TSR, because whether you like Gary Gygax or not, he had this what he would do, because they could not pay them full price, he would assign them a royalty percentage for their game. If it was successful and did a good job, they would get a percentage, and I believe the percentage was quite high. It was like 10%, sometimes maybe even more, and then over time it dwindled down and got smaller and smaller. And so why did Gary and Dave have a falling out over the ownership of Dungeons and Dragons? Jordan?
think everyone can relate to this if you ever done a group project in college or uni or had a job where you had, this is human nature, right? I don't think any of us are surprised when money's involved and work's involved. You say, oh, so-and-so did this, so-and-so did that. And it was mentioned earlier in our discussion, what's the value of intellectual contributions as opposed to like financial risk and real legwork, to publish and write. And so I'm sure Dave Arneson knew, excuse me, that he contributed very much to the concept of D&D. And I read that there was some discomfort or unhappiness with some of the liberties that Gary then took expounding the rules when he was codifying it all. And he just kind of ignored Dave's displeasure with those expansions to the rules or whatever. And then later when Gary wanted to do Advanced D&D, which, Wally, you held up your book, it just has Gary's name on it. There was the argument of like, well, you didn't really contribute to this. It's a different property. And Dave said, no, I still get a cut, and so... And then there was stuff you mentioned, like that they had a duel earlier in like gaming. I think they clearly had some clashing of personalities to begin with, but their hobby brought them together in maybe a little bit of an explosive way. And so fill in the gaps with your own experiences, everyone, of doing group projects when money gets involved, and I think you can make some assumptions.
What about you, Wally?
I think Jordan hit pretty much everything that I wanted to say about that. So from what I understand, the outcome of hey, I'm not getting royalties for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons with just like Jordan said, with Gary's name on it. I believe that the courts said that this is different than D&D, so the royalties didn't have to be paid, and that's why Dave's name's not on there. But on the red box, so after the third iteration of basic D&D, you can see right there that Dave is still listed in the book. I don't know what that means or if that helps any, but that's all I have. I'm going to pass my turn.
What about you, Josiah?
He's going to sneeze.
I had a sneeze.
You got to sneeze, man. Just do it.
No,
get it out.
I've got it controlled now. It's back in whatever part of your body sneezes or snort in. God, my brain is dying.
Inner ear.
Yeah, in the inner ear by the hammer in the stirrup. What was the question?
Oh, the question is, why did Gary and Dave have a falling out over the ownership of Dungeons and Dragons?
Because they were both fucking neckbeard, controversial, contrarian assholes, and they made an amazing thing together, and then money got involved, and then they said, oh, fuck, I guess money. Like, that's the real, like, I think Jordan really said it very articulated and eloquently, and like exactly what I would have said if I had a brain that worked right now, is that basically, yeah, money got involved and people felt slighted. I think that from Gary's end, he probably felt that all of his work was worth more to the game, and I think that Dave probably felt the exact same way about his intellectual contributions to the game, and it was just an inability to see things from the other's perspective, I think, because in reality we know this game would not exist if it were not for both of them. But I mean, try telling that to Gary when he's like got a family to feed and shit, and like this is his livelihood on the line, and same thing for Dave, right? So I think that, yeah, it's just a real nasty combination of greed and also the fact that I don't think either of them realized how big this was going to become. Like, I think they kind of maybe were like, whenever you're starting a project, you have that like, oh, hopefully it turns into this. And their hopeful situation was in like the bottom end of what D&D ended up becoming while they were involved, like it just kind of exploded. So yeah, I think that it went real Wolf of Wall Street real fast.
AJ, the conflict between Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax
is less important overall than what happened with the blooms and the controversy. And like at one point, Gary Gygax had to hire a bodyguard because of the whole satanic panic thing. But like when he left, the company was earning something like $29 million a year in 85. And then the company ran into the ground. And now when it's been taken over by Wizard of the Coast has owned Dungeons and Dragons longer than TSR had. So we're talking about a previous era now, which is well and truly eclipsed and is the past. And I think we should probably look more to the future. But as to the falling out of those two, friends fall out over silly things. And the pressures that they were facing at the time were more than sufficient to damage a working relationship between a couple of gamers. I mean, yeah, who hasn't had people in their gaming group have conflict of personality and interests and public spats and stuff like that result in, unfortunately, very creative and gifted individuals no longer wanting to talk to each other.
Yeah, and that's without money involved, right?
Yeah, that's without millions of dollars involved. Well, tens of thousands. And of course, Gary Gygax, he was very motivated to feed his family of kids. He'd lost his job as an insurance underwriter in 1970, I think it was. And that was, he needed to get into publishing and he needed to get stuff done. But existing publishers weren't touching it with a barge pole. So he had to get investors. And those investors were driving him with pressure to get things done. And that pressure resulted in Dungeons and Dragons getting out there. Dave Arneson didn't have any part of that. He was just, contributing ideas and stuff, but he was still very much in the mindset of this is, a role-playing game that we're playing amongst this group and social group of people and stuff. So Gary was very much business, because he had to be. And so when it came time to developing the second iteration and advanced Dungeons and Dragons stuff, he very much thought of himself as the one who was solely responsible for that. And that falling out and that personality difference between the two unfortunately manifested in him cutting Dave Arneson further and further out of the public eye until he didn't acknowledge him at all. And that eventually wound up as a court battle where, it became a more a matter of public record that Dave Arneson actually was very much involved. And that rumbling and dissent has carried on for many, many years with a lot of debate and stuff. But yeah, I guess we can clear the air for anybody who's watching this.
So my understanding is that Dave and Gary, because TSR was funded by Gary, Don, and also by Brian Blume, they really dealt with the business side of things. And unfortunately, as a result of that, Dave Arneson didn't really get that much of a say in terms of the running of TSR, even though he would certainly a significant involvement in the development of the game in its early stages, in its inception.
Yeah, he wasn't a shareholder.
He wasn't a shareholder, and this was one of his problems. He was too young. He just didn't have any money, and Gary was established more than he was. So as a result, Gary made an arrangement with Dave that basically he would get 10% royalties on anything Dungeons and Dragons. And this went on for a while, but unfortunately, as shareholders change and so forth, they don't want to give that 10%. They're like, no, we want to keep that money. We don't want to give it to Dave. And Gary would always have to remind them, because they were doing this with a lot of the other creators as well. They would give them a percentage of royalties for their their development process. And unfortunately, at the point, and this actually happened, he went to court multiple times. They don't necessarily they settled out of court most of the time.
It's an important point that you can copyright a rule set, but you can't copyright role playing, the very concept of role playing. So Dave Arneson's main contribution to it had been written out more and more of the game, and that his main contribution, role playing, wasn't something that he could physically own.
Yeah. And that's part of the problem. But so what had happened, I believe, is that, and it had actually happened before Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. It just got worse. It's because when he released that, Gary decided that his name was the only name that needed to be on there. He'd done everything as far as he was concerned. It was his baby, and he didn't need to give any royalties. TSR, in terms of the board members, they were quite happy. Those people who were shareholders, like, that's exactly what we want. The problem is the courts did not see it that way, and Gary knew that he had to settle out of court because he was going to lose a lot of money because he was actually wrong. And so what happened is, and this actually happened multiple times, but usually Gary would get involved and then they'd settle out of court. there were a number of times when Gary was either too busy or TSR decided to get involved, and the management got involved, and they ballsed things up, and Dave Arneson walked away with a lot of money from a court hearing. So that's really what it sort of boiled down to. And unfortunately, it is something that kind of sticks, because it wasn't just one occasion. There were multiple occasions. Just the one that people remember the most is the one around advanced Dungeons and Dragons being developed. Okay, so all of this stuff is all very well, but I think that given all of this, it would be useful for people to understand what Gary's style of play and what Dave's style of play is like, because a lot of people, I don't think they actually understand what they were like in terms of how they ran their games. I'm not talking about convention games, I'm not talking about the rule system. I mean, their own personal home games looked very different to what a lot of people realise. So my first question is to Jordan. What was Gary Gygax's Dungeons and Dragons style of game like when he played at home?
Here's the vibe I got, 'cause that's really all I have. The vibe I got was that Gary, from the modules he published, was very much more of like a linear story style. A lot like the modules we get today, and a lot of the modules that came before 5e, where you get plopped in a town, you get a scenario, and that develops into some, like the concept of the BBEG and all that stuff. I think that feels like Gary's way. And then, to me, Dave's way felt more like the dungeon delving hack and slash, a little bit more true to the wargaming, even though like his group kind of brought in the role-playing part of it. That was the vibe I got. I don't know how you feel, Wally.
Yeah.
Very, very similar. Admittedly, I didn't find a lot of one way or the other on this that would have satisfied giving myself a solid opinion. But I kind of feel like Gary was Marvel Universe versus DC Universe for Dave, because the few things that I did find was Dave had a lot darker games, which might be like the hack and slash. And if I were to imagine what Gary's games would be like, I would imagine Gary would play test a lot more things. He'd get ideas and want to try them out, where Dave has this already set in place and we already know what the rules are and how we play it, and we just play the same game over and over. But again, that's pure speculation on my point.
What about you, Josiah, in terms of the style of play that they were incorporating into the game?
Yeah, I didn't find anything conclusive enough to really be able to say anything with confidence, but I think what Wally said is pretty much how I feel about it, in terms for whatever that's worth. It seems like Gary was a lot more into experimentation. Like I feel like for him, he got a lot of joy out of making up new stuff and iterating on stuff that was already there. Like, it was never like, oh, we did a module, that was fun, I'm going to run that module with another group because it was fun. It was like, I'm going to run that module with another group, but this time we're changing this and this and this and this and this, and I'm going to take like notes about it. You know what I mean? That's kind of the impression that I get from it. But again, like, I wasn't there, so it's a tough question to ask for sure. But I think people in general, like, it kind of goes without saying that like there's some legendary games hosted by both of these guys that like still get talked about to this day. So. Yeah.
What about you, AJ, in terms of the style of Gary Gygax's game and the style of Dave Arneson's game? What do you pick out of that?
It's difficult to like. I've heard anecdotes of Gary Gygax being behind a partition, so he's like this voice who's narrating stuff. So very much theatre of the mind. And not so much miniatures and things like that. I mean, he certainly played with miniatures and stuff, and he experimented with different play styles and things. And I imagine him playing games with his kids was a lot different from other games where he played with more adult themes and things. But I'm not privy to those stories. Dave Arneson was more like you've got an objective, you've got a situation, and your characters are dealing with it with whatever means necessary. So in that, the closest approximation we've got to that to these days would be like Lamentations of the Flame Princess and things like that, where characters are going to get mowed down. They're going to get minced. case in point, the encounter with the troll, where he didn't describe what the troll's abilities were and things like that, and this character gets minced by this troll, and the player is very angry about it, because he felt like he got hoodwinked, flim-flammed, and is now left with nothing to do in the game, sort of thing. So he was very much, you make your decisions, you face the consequences. No, too bad if you get minced, you have to sit in the kids' table for a while. So that, yeah. Whereas Gygax probably had more of a railroady style of role-playing play, but I don't know for sure. And again, consequences and things. And he also was interested in balancing, not only balancing, like if the players ended up doing something that was successful over and over and over again, he would develop a monster that would counter that. Disenchanters, rust monsters, the boule, which was designed to go barreling down a corridor and bowl everything in its path. We've developed a lot of lore on top of these things, but the original conception was very much an anti-player tactic. So he had a lot of anti-player monsters and stuff that were part of the game. Part and parcel was that, like, for instance, barbarians used to get experience points for destroying magical items and being anti-magic, because he wanted counters to the magic users. He wanted to set up conflict in the game between two players with opposing ideals. Cavaliers and things like that would be compelled by their knightly virtues to do all sorts of heinous shit that would stir up a lot of conflict for the player group, to distract them from their ongoing missions and things like that. So yeah, it was interesting. So yeah, I think Arneson's version of D&D was more basic but sandboxy, and I think Gygax's was more sort of campaign orientated, and a lot more fantasy elements and things like that. Like he was willing to go into some pretty bizarre and zany stuff, robots, crash spaceships, veggie pygmies, that sort of thing. So yeah, and then of course next iteration you get. Once the boomer generation of D&D gurus has passed, and you get the new generation, you got mind flayers and the far realm and all that sort of stuff. That Monty Cook and Bruce Cordell. Oh yeah, fantastic stuff. But yeah, you got to remember these guys. The original developers of D&D were boomers, and so they had a pretty narrow social view on things.
So I found, I think like all of you, that actually trying to figure out how Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson ran their games, like, outside of the public eye and outside of sort of personal, the only way I could find anything was through their family, their friends, interviews, what they'd said, the Blackmoor group and what they had to say. Family members of Gary, and mostly it was family members of Gary who sort of had things I could actually see them saying, I was in his game and this is what he did. So what I could pick out from it is Gary Gygax didn't seem to have books on the table. There was actually no rules out. This is one of the things that one of his sons, Luke, would say. It's like there's no rules out there, and other people who his friends who said the same thing. He used theatre of the mind, so AJ's talking about like having a screen. His original screen was apparently just the filing cabinet. He just pulled it across, and he would just narrate and talk, and then ask you to respond. You couldn't even see him; it was just a voice. You couldn't tell what he was thinking by looking at his eyes or his body language, because he removed all of that completely. He did not draw out maps. You had to draw your own maps, apparently, is one of the things that was highlighted. And if you wanted a map, you had to be a player and you needed to pay attention, because he was just going to describe everything. He didn't actually use miniatures, and in his home games, but he did make up miniatures and he did use miniatures. But I think that was actually more for public play than it was for his home games. And he rolled all the dice. Like, nobody really got to roll any dice. He was doing most of the dice rolling. primarily, I believe, when they were using dice. Although Luke did say that they didn't even use dice initially for combat, they were just using scissor, paper, stones in terms of resolving combat, because they didn't even use the chainmail rules. They I'm going to resolve combat when you scissor, paper, stones. That's what it'll play that game. That'll determine who wins and who loses.
That works with kids playing the game too. I mean, you don't want to overly complicate a rule set.
Yeah, and that may be what he just did with his kids rather than with everybody else. Dave Arneson's style, surprisingly, the Blackmoor group said they would just gather around a table. There was no miniatures on the table. There was no rules on the table. Ping pong table. Yep. It was theatre of the mind. He would just describe everything. But the only difference is he didn't hide himself. He was there. They could see him. His groups were quite large. Gary's home groups were a lot smaller. And Dave Arneson's groups were really made up of teenagers, a lot of teenagers.
Like 11 or 12 of them sitting around the ping pong table with the map of the castle in the middle.
Yeah, people are, going through college or university, and as far as I understand it, my country, university, there were no play pieces whatsoever from what they had described, and he would draw out maps for them. So he would produce maps for them, but he would still use the concept of the fog of war in his games to a large extent. And then very character focused. Apparently he would build stuff for characters. Like the adventure would be tailored for their characters. And he would do that on the fly. So he was very much an improviser. A lot of creative stuff. My understanding is he incorporated fantasy but also science fiction. And his daughter seemed to indicate that he had a passion for Star Trek and for Conan the Barbarian. The Conan stories were a big factor for him, and so was Lord of the Rings. So he was more into the thought of Lord of the Rings and Conan and a few other fantasy novels. So that's my understanding of their style. And, with all of that, I have my last question, because this is like the question that everybody sort of throws out there and like almost nobody knows. You know why? It's because nothing is actually that easy to describe in development, right? And that is, given that we know all of that stuff, or we think we know, because it should be clear by now that we don't actually know everything there is to know about these people because they're gone now. Like, how many original Dungeons and Dragons versions were there? Like, how many versions of the game are there? When you count them all up and you look at them where they actually made changes, like how many are there? Jordan, what did you find?
So I figured everyone was going to research this really well. So I just said, let's see what I remember. Okay? Because I'm a youngin'. Some people have been there for these past editions, but let's see what me, who learns through memes, knows. We got the first edition of just Dungeons and Dragons. I think AD&D and second edition are the same thing. Then there's third edition, 3.5, fourth edition, and then fifth edition. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 versions. But that's just like under the branding of D&D, right? You can open it up to many different offshoots of role-playing and wargaming, obviously. But if we're just talking D&D, that's what I know.
Yeah, I was only looking for the clones, not the clones. I wasn't looking at the clones. I was just looking at the official Dungeons and Dragons rule sets that were out there.
Okay, I'm going with 6.
Okay, so Wally, what did you have in terms of like how many versions of this game is there?
7.
7. Do you know which ones they are?
So
I love your concise answer.
$1, Bob.
I classify them different because you could probably, like when I Googled this, I think I got the answer. It said like 11 or something like that. But here's how I classify them. So I classify the original, what they called the white box, which I guess was actually a wood box or something different. So I consider that, 0 edition, whatever, original D&D, ODD. Before Advanced Dungeons and Dragons came out, they made a revision to that they called Basic. Me personally, I would still consider that OD&D. I guess some of the pages in the front were still original Dungeons and Dragons. It's just carried over. So we still only have one edition, and then we've got a D&D, so that'll be two, and that was Gary Gygax's thing. And then in 81 and then in 83 is the evolution of Beckme, which I consider Beckme, which is basic, expert, companion, master, and immortals. I consider that an edition all by itself. And that was being produced simultaneously as first edition Dungeons and Dragons. So we've got OD&D.
That actually makes it the longest running edition of the game.
And a lot of people have said it's been the best as far, but I mean, compared to AD&D and Beckme, a lot of people said that by the time companion set and master set came out, that it was actually a lot better than AD&D. But
I just wish Mystara was better.
Yeah. So yeah, OD&D, first edition, Beckme, second edition, third edition, fourth edition, fifth edition. That's my 7.
What about you, Josiah? What did you come up with in terms of like how many versions of this game is there?
Oh, I'm going to give an answer that's going to make everyone watching this fucking groan audibly. But the real answer to that question is as many tables as there are out there with people playing the game, because everyone's table is so goddamn different and everyone has their own homebrew rules. And even outside of like rules, everyone has their own like table culture. Like there are stuff that at one table, it's like, yeah, this is how we do it. Where at another table, people would be like, what the hell are you doing? Like, what do you mean, right? So that's my answer, because I knew that someone was going to have like the actual number, and I was like, I literally was about to Google, and I was like, yeah, fuck it. Like, no, this, that is kind of a cop-out answer. But also, I do genuinely think that there's a lot of truth to that like, I don't know, these games are built to be so modular, and I feel like Wizards of the Coast coasts by a little bit on that lately. A lot of their books have maybe been a little too open-ended in some regards, but the fact remains that like I don't know, any that's why I find all these homebrew or these errata rules so funny, that it's got everyone's blood boiling, because like I don't care. I couldn't tell you the last time I looked at a source book for a D&D monster and was like, this is exactly how I'm going to run it. It usually starts with me being like, oh, what do I want to do? I want to have monsters that do this. That's a thing a storm giant could do. That's cool. Like, I don't know. I think that there's a lot of truth in that everyone's table is kind of its own game in a lot of different ways.
It's like,
so that's my answer.
It's like the saying, you never step in the same ocean twice. You never step in the same D&D game twice.
Yeah,
on different tables.
Exactly. You know, like we can all see the D&D as the ocean, but like there's different parts of the water, different little puddles, different fish nibbling at your feet when you step in there, different murder hobos derailing your campaign, whatever. That's my answer for you.
Thank you. I was hoping somebody would have some sort of answer like that, because it's a very insightful answer. Whether anybody realizes it or not, I think it is very insightful. AJ, what do you think? How many versions of Dungeons and Dragons is there really out there?
There's only ever been one version of Dungeons and Dragons, and that was the original. After that, so the original 1974 Dungeons and Dragons original set, which comprised of the 3 volumes Men and Magic, Monsters and Treasure, and the Underworld Wilderness Adventures books, that was the original, just Dungeons and Dragons. After that, it split into D&D Basic, and that necessitated them calling the more advanced set the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. What we play today in 5th edition is Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, or you could say Basic Part 2, for those of you who don't like the slimmed down version of the D&D rules that 5th edition is. But so the Basic was split up into different iterations of it that was developed over the years. So you had Holmes, and then the BX Molde version, and then Mensa, and then it culminated in the Cyclopedia, which was a collection of all of the stuff that was what we're seeing in 5th edition now, where they're putting out the final version of D&D 5e with the Mordenkainen's Monsters of the Multiverse stuff. They're squishing in all of the errata from all the different books into one thing and trying to get us to buy it again.
Yeah.
But so then we stopped calling it AD&D after. So there's first edition, second edition, revised second edition, which was like the second edition part 2.5, and then you had third edition, and then very quickly after that there was 3.5 edition. That's when we stopped kind of calling it Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and just started naming it by the edition. So it was second edition was those two versions, and then third edition was 3 and 3.5, which we ended up just calling 3.5, and then fourth edition was the disastrous iteration that came after that, which almost tanked the hobby and split it into Pathfinder and D&D, and now we've got fifth edition, which has tanked Pathfinder and is now its thing, and we're just starting to go into what I think is going to be called 5.5, because we haven't really, I don't think we've got 6th edition coming up. I think we've got 5.5. Hopefully 5.5 is going to incorporate, or 6th edition is going to be the company recognizing that there's a lot of third-party content for 5th edition, which should really be included in the main game. So when you're talking about everybody's game being different, 5th edition is like anybody who's been buying products from the Dungeon Masters Guild and Drive-Through RPG and all of the third-party content and stuff. There's fantastic additions to the game, which I think need to be recognized by the parent company and brought into the fold. They've done it before. They published the timeline of the Forgotten Realms, the grand history of the Forgotten Realms from a fan work, and turned it into an actual publication. I think Wizards of the Coast would behoove itself to fold the Dungeon Masters Guild more officially into it, give the authors their due, and incorporate some of those fantastic elements that have been included into it. Like they've developed more diplomatic play style, like elements and rule sets from different things like the Stargate SG1 5th edition version and various other publications which have come out recently. So I don't think 5th edition's true scope will be seen for a number of years yet. It's far more. It's grown. It's ballooned into this huge thing that I don't think we've really seen the full scope of 5th edition yet. If you just buy the core books and go by that, that's one version of 5th edition. But there's thousands of other versions that people are playing right now because they've been buying all these products and adding whatever they want to the brew. You know, it's a cauldron that they're throwing their rule sets and homebrew into.
You want to know something wild?
Yes.
Did you know that they're making a Dark Souls tabletop RPG that's going to use the 5th edition core system? I don't know how I feel about that, but that's happening and it's real, and it's fucking insane that they're like.
Well, you've been painting some Dark Souls miniatures recently, haven't you, Josiah?
I have, yeah, and that's from the just Dark Souls board game, which is just like a one and done board game kind of thing, but. Yeah, I found that out today, actually, that they're doing a Dark Souls tabletop role-playing game that uses the 5th edition system, which I think is bonkers.
Yeah.
Also, just before I give up my time, my theory is that I think they are going to do a D&D 5.5, but I think they're going to call it Advanced Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. I think that they're going to cash in on the nostalgia market for a bunch of people who are nostalgic for a version of the game that they never played. That's my hot take for the day.
Basically, if we all call it Advanced 5th edition, that's what it will become, because let's face it. Yeah. We've
how
got a
about
voice.
D&D 5e next? D&D next.
Yeah, they tried to call it
5e.
next. You can't
D&D
tell us what to call the
next.
game. Yeah.
By the way, 5th edition is by far my favorite.
So,
Whatever the current edition is my favorite.
so when I looked at this question,
I like
because
fourth.
I didn't really fully understand this question, and I actually had to do an awful lot of research, and every time I looked up the answer, I found a different answer. And then you find out that between every new publication of something, there was some rules variant changes that you could say, like, there's a 0.5 in there somewhere, you know, or maybe even a 0.3 and then a 0.6 in some cases.
Yeah.
So it's not really that clear. As far as I can tell officially, there's 12. There's the original game in 1974.
Oh, right. Fourth edition had essentials.
That's right. That's right. You got it. I forgot about it too, and I played the game. How did I forget? Anyway, basic first ed edition in 1977, and then at the same time they branched off and they did Advanced Dungeons and Dragons first ed edition in 1977 as well. So they were traveling at the same point. Then they actually probably did more development in basic than they did in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So you got basic versions and second version of basic in 1981, and then the third version of basic in 1983. So those are actually pretty quick turnovers if you consider that game. So it actually developed fairly quickly. It wasn't till 1984 that we actually got Advanced Dungeons and Dragons second ed edition, which was breaking away completely from Gary Gygax's involvement because somebody did not want to have to pay Gary any royalties whatsoever if she could help it, and that's what happened there. And then you've got
the Gary Gygax on her.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like karma comes back. And then there's the Cyclopedia rules in 1991, which just confuses everything even more by having everything pulled together in one place, I suppose. It's supposed to help or make it worse. Then you've got third ed edition in 2000, and then you've got 3.5 in 2003, and then you got fourth ed edition, which I played, and that was 2008. And very quickly we got 2010 was the Essentials D&D 4E, which, to be frank, I don't believe the core rules were actually changed that much. I think it was really around how the characters worked. They were simplified down rather than being quite as complicated as the 4E characters were.
And that's quite simple.
Well, yeah. So they made it even simpler. You got two things you could do, if I could remember right, at low level. And then you get 5E in 2014. And we're not really looking at 5.5 till 2024. So fifth ed edition's actually done pretty well. And yes, there were some revisions along the way and all amongst that, but that's as far as I can tell in terms of the game. My last question is, because I've argued this with people before, and so I'm going to say it right now, this is my personal bias in terms of a question to ask. Okay? So feel free to do your thing. And that is, was Dungeons & Dragons officially, or originally, should I say, was Dungeons & Dragons originally a miniatures war game? Because I get people saying this all the time, and it always annoys me because I have my own personal opinion about what it is. I played tabletop war games. So I'm not going to say any more. I'm going to let other people speak, and then I'll say anything more. So was D&D originally a miniatures war game, Jordan?
Definitely evolved out of it, but to me it doesn't seem like it was. It seemed like it was a new creature with roots in wargaming. And I don't think people would play it if it was just another war game. So that's my answer. I actually got to jump off a little early, so I will see everyone's answers when this recording goes up. My kids are not being good about bedtime, so I must go. But this was fun. Thanks, everyone.
Take care, Jordan.
Thank you, Jordan. And I will see you next week. Okay, Wally. My question to you, was D&D originally a miniatures war game?
No.
Any particular reason?
I think Jordan kind of touched on it. I mean, there's some inspiration from miniature war games. I mean, they're like, hey, this is cool with soldiers and stuff, and then they started adding some fantasy elements. But it's kind of like, the color blue is your war games, your color yellow is everything else, and it made green, which is a totally new color. So D&D is a totally new color for me.
What about you, Josiah?
Well, allow me to respond to this question with a brief story. Okay. My grandfather.
I'm going to just point out right now, you are the one who told me I needed to be quick, and I'm trying to make this sure this is under 3 hours.
We're
under
well
3
past
hours.
That now. We're well past that now.
We're almost 2.5.
My grandfather fought in the Second World War on my mom's side. He fought with the Dutch resistance because he was a Dutchman himself. And I think that's great. you know, like he was out there doing his thing, apparently reporting on the locations of the Germans' trains, and they would tell the Americans, who would then do what they do and blow the bejesus out of it. So that's great. Does that mean that I should be entitled to a veteran's discount because my progenitors were in a war, you know? And I think that's what the question is here. Is D&D a war game? No. D&D is a child of war games. One of its parents was a war game. But I do not think Dungeons and Dragons inherently is a war game. I think it can be a war game if you want it to be, if you use those books and supplements or whatever, official or otherwise. I think it can be a war game. I think that it would not exist in its current form if it were not for war games, but I definitely do follow the line of thinking that I think it is a completely new beast altogether.
What about you, AJ? Question.
I would say that 4th edition D&D was a war game, was a miniatures-based war game. 5th edition is no longer. It's gone back to its roots of being an optional war game. So you can use miniatures or not, and it's been that way since Blackmoor, and it's been that way since the first Dungeons and Dragons. Like, I didn't use miniatures until quite later on, and our miniatures were very, like, we didn't have a big collection of miniatures and stuff. We had like one giant covered every large monster that you can imagine, and I ended up using a lump of plasticine to model dragons and snakes, and we fought a lot of snakes. So yeah, it's been optional for Dungeons and Dragons for a very long time. It was only like with 4th edition that they were trying to market specific products and stuff, and also Dungeons and Dragons being into computer games because of the way that they're just organized, more sort of miniatures games. You know, you have set distances and things, and very visual representation of stuff on the screen for you, and less freedom to do whatever you want and go wherever you want. You have some very one-track games that way. Like, for instance, even Dark Alliance, a relatively recent D&D game, is very much a railroad where you go down a set track of, like, you have the options to go path A or path B, and you can run around and do things within that little scope of that little battle area, that encounter area, but it's very much one encounter area after another after another. You can't just go wandering off into the wilderness and do whatever you want. So yeah. And the more I think the more a role-playing game is open to going wherever you want and doing whatever you want and building whatever sandbox you want, the better it is, if you ask me. But Dungeons and Dragons has always been optional, apart from 4th edition was very difficult to be even gridless in 4th edition. That was quite a controversy at the time, to play without a grid. You just measure distances and things like that, or approximation of where you want to be. But yeah.
So, given that this is my biased question that I'm putting in here, because I get this a lot. I played tabletop war games for a long time. So Warhammer and Warhammer 4K, and so when I came from playing that to playing Dungeons and Dragons, like, I guess properly, because before that I just did mutant things that I don't know if I could. Do you call it Dungeons and Dragons, what I was doing before? I don't know. For me, I didn't see any resemblance to tabletop wargaming in the slightest, because we didn't use squares, we didn't use any of the kind of concepts that they were including in the kinds of games we were playing. We had a ruler out, so even when they used a grid, for me, a grid with squares didn't mean tabletop wargaming. It just meant, I don't have to use a measuring tape. Thank God for that. Because frankly, it was annoying.
It's a tactical space.
It's a tactical space, so you had to measure everything out carefully with a ruler. So I'd say it's its own thing. And I get the impression that both Gary and Dave, because they use theatre of the mind in their own personal games, really weren't looking at it being that. And Dave Arneson had said many, many times that he was rebelling against tabletop wargaming. It was the exact. He was trying to do the exact opposite in many respects, because he was sick and tired of all of that. So that doesn't mean that it can't be a tabletop war game if you want to make it that. And they certainly, you're right, AJ, they try to do that with 4E and tie that and fix that in. But how successful did that turn out? Some people loved it, and a lot of people didn't. So I would say it's not. It's not. It really isn't. It doesn't bear any resemblance. And I love miniatures. I love it.
I think if they wanted to divorce themselves entirely from it, they would get rid of ranges for things like dark vision, 120 feet or 60 feet or whatever. That it would just be like near, medium, far. And that way it's just like. How distant is it? Well, that seems pretty far to me. Like, how much can you move in and around would really be the only real measure of distance. It's be like, what are you physically capable of? But like vision is very subjective. And like how far does a fireball go before it fizzles out and things like that? Like, well, you can lob an arrow a long way. It doesn't mean you're going to hit something. That sort of thing.
Yeah.
Can I add something? So reading the question, was D&D originally a miniatures war game? When I think of a miniatures war game, I'm thinking player versus player. I'm thinking we have armies and we're going up against each other to decide a winner. But Dungeons and Dragons is we're all on the same team to get together to tell a story, to have fun and kill monsters. And so when I think of miniatures in Dungeons and Dragons, I just think of them as objects to help us imagine that, just tools or accessories.
Right.
So I don't know if that makes anything different or not, but that's the way I kind of look at it.
I wish I had said that, Wally, and I'm so glad that you did, because that's actually one of the key points that I always understood. It's one of the reasons why I stopped playing tabletop war games, is because it was always an adversary. I didn't make friends. There was a competitor in front of me. And so going to Dungeons and Dragons, that competitive thing was gone. So for me, it just wasn't a war game anymore. It was a completely different thing. Look, I want to thank everybody for showing up for this, because this was a lot of extra work from many of us in terms of research and coming up with answers and answering a lot of questions. Yes, exactly. And so it was a big ask. All of their information is down in the description if you want to go and check them out. And also, too, if you're going to give us a comment, by all means, comment on the video. Be nice to everybody, because I would appreciate it. Everybody has taken quite a bit of time out of their day to do this. But before we leave, would you like to tell everybody where they can find you, Wally?
Absolutely. I have a best-selling book on Drive-Thru RPG, the Journal of Puzzle Encounters. If you could pick that up, that would be awesome. There's 60 puzzles in there to run in your game. Other than that, catch me over on YouTube, where I demonstrate puzzle and trap videos so that you can drop them right in your game. Wally DM.
Thanks. And Josiah, can you tell everybody where they can find you?
Yeah, you can find me on YouTube as Dungeon Dad. I make videos about monsters. Typically what I do is I take old school monsters, convert them into 5th edition, and then do videos about them. So if that sounds like something you want to get in on, then YouTube Dungeon Dad, that's the place to do it, baby.
Absolutely, it certainly is. AJ, would you like to tell everybody about you? I'm sure they already know who you are, but...
I am the warm and squishy centre of Dungeons and Dragons lore. I've put more people to sleep learning about goblins than I can possibly imagine. I make videos about Dungeons and Dragons lore, and I have done for several years. I've also done some side projects, like I ran a Kickstarter for silicone battle mats, and I've also developed unique dice sets that you can get from Amazon and stuff. Little things like that. And you can find me on Facebook and all of the Sages groups that I admin. So Sages of the Forgotten Realms, Sages of Greyhawk, and Sages of Dark Sun, and things like that. That's where those groups are just focusing on that setting in specific, rather than just Dungeons and Dragons in general, which tends to keep the communities fairly focused and friendly. Yeah. And I also have a Discord server, which is also very friendly.
Thank you. Look, thank you to everybody who showed up, including Jordan, who wasn't able to stay for the very end because he had other things to do, and I totally understand. Thank you for everybody who was watching. And hey, till next time, keep rolling those 20s.